Okay, hi everybody. This is my presentation. I didn't see anyone who looked like me, gender and racial representation in board gaming. And this is actually my PhD dissertation. I'm a PhD candidate at York and X University in Toronto. And I am so pleased and proud to be part of the Analog Game Studies conference. And thank you so much for having me. What feels like 1,000 years ago, I was a corporate consultant, worked in large multinationals, mainly in tech and life sciences, worked for a number of large multinational public relation, communication, marketing firms. And I did what was called corporate dashboards, which are basically ways to track the performance of a market, a sector, as well as an individual company. So business leaders would walk around with my dashboards on tablets and see how their company was doing, how the market was doing. And one of the things I learned doing that work is that numbers were definitely privileged more than stories by business leaders. So one of the things I wanted to do, it was also my own personal curiosity about a question I couldn't find the answer to. What's the demography of the labor of board game design? What does the artwork composition look like, specifically on Board Game Geek? And I chose that portal as a way to sort of engage with the current contemporary cultural practice of board gaming. And the Analog Game Studies team was gracious enough to publish my first study in 2018, which got a lot of really good feedback, lots of great reports, and I understand, a fair number of hits. One of the other things that happened, though, was I got a lot of backlash, and I likened it, the experience, to being attacked by thousands of bees for weeks and weeks. But it was a really interesting experience. And again, good, bad, good feedback, bad feedback. But I actually decided to do my entire PhD, as you're learning about today. And I still get fan mail, just like this good fellow here. It's a farce. You get a PhD for that useless crap. So I get a fair amount of negative feedback on the work that I do, but there are things that keep me going, tiny wins. And back in 2018, I got a note. Geek mail from Andrew Hackert, who sent me 500 geek gold. And for me, as a newbie in board gaming at that time, had started my profile a year before. I was pretty surprised to get this note, and I'm of course a huge fan of Munchkin, and it meant the world to me to get this note. You could have knocked me over with a feather. I think I may have yelled aloud to my partner. It was the greatest moment. And I wrote him a effusive fangirl note back, apologizing for my delayed reply and saying, I'm a Munchkin evangelist. Thank you so much for this. And I will pay this forward, this act of generosity, random act of kindness that Andrew Hacker did for me. And I have to say that this was kind of a pivotal moment for me, because I thought, if someone, this plugged into the industry, thinks this research has value, as his note shared, he was going to share it with everyone he could. I thought there's something here. And I wanted to dedicate this presentation to the memory of Andrew Hackard, who made a huge difference in my world just by being an incredibly kind and welcoming human being. And sadly, Andrew passed away in June of this year. I have to say that, without his encouragement, I probably wouldn't have continued this work. So I wanted to dedicate it to him. So what I did with this research is I doubled my database from the 2018 study, and I basically expanded it to 400 games and looked at the game design mixture. And I looked at the top 200 Board Game Geek ranked games in terms of their artwork. And we're going to start with the artwork. And so basically looking at what is an invitation to most people. A cover of a piece of board game art, is that welcome, welcoming people in to have a play or purchasing experience. And that's marketing 101. And what I found was about 2,000 representations. I counted everything: fauna, human representation. If it was sentient, I counted it. And that basically totaled up to about 2,000 images. Not quite, but just about. And what I found in representation that I could discern is there was a skew toward maleness, men, boys, at 76.8%. And 22.2% were women or girls, depictions of women or girls in that top 200. And then I looked at race and saw that 82.5% were representations of white presenting characters, and 17.5% were representations of the Black, Indigenous, persons of color. So, this was actually my second research question, and we're delving into the artwork for a reason. In creating that dialogue with a community and having discussions actively online with people about my preliminary research, I found that there's a lack of diversity in the artwork, absolutely a lack. But I get comments like this. This is actually a Board Game Geek thread that happened just a few days ago, about an interview I did with Jason Perez on Shelf Story. And I thought this was a really interesting way of putting it. This individual was saying that the numbers are just a picture of the state of things, not how we got there. It's up to us to investigate the causes and the conversations about why this kind of skew happened. And I thought that was a really interesting point, and one that I'm definitely making in the dissertation. One of the criticisms I've received from the community is, a little bit of an over orientation toward the US market. And why am I doing that? I'm doing that because the US market is the single largest economy in the world. Can be certainly a make or break market for a lot of cultural productions, creative industries, including the games market. For example, Americans spent $12.5 trillion on durable and non-durable goods and services in a down year in 2020. So a really, really important consumer space. So let's take a look at the demography of the US market, because, again, that whiteness, that maleness in the skew, must be for a reason. Publishers are making that for a reason. And why are they making that decision? So, let's take a look at, this large consumer hub, which is the US. It's not the only one, but it is a big one. And we can see that a 40-60 split is right now within the US. The demographic makeup of the US. Black, Indigenous, persons of color make up 39.99% of the US population, and white non-Hispanics make up 60.1%. So we can see a 40-60 split. So it's not because they're trying to appeal to a population-wide demographic mix. They're not making that decision for that reason. So we can discount that. And then, again, just to anticipate, and I have, with the mention of the fact that it's the largest economy in the world, someone rightly pointed out that, board games are not only prevalent in the US, they're in fact global. And using US data to claim that board games are not representative of the population is flawed. This individual, shared with me that he had concerns about my research and wanted me to take and compare it to a much wider data set. So let's take that at face value and say, okay, what does the world look like from a larger and more expansive frame? And here's what the breakdown of the globe looks like. It's 80-20. 80 is Black, Indigenous, persons of color, making up 80% of the world's population, and are the people of the global majority. And that is a fair and empirical statement. And that is actually overtaking, PGM is actually overtaking BIPOC as a descriptor. And it makes sense because it is valid empirical. It is a valid and empirical assertion. So it's not a global frame either. So this decision-making on the part of publishers and the part of creators to skew white and male is not based on any kind of population rationale. So that we can discount that as a reason. And, let's look at Canada. That makes a little bit more sense. So Canada is much, much whiter than the US in terms of the composition of our broad scale demographic makeup. 20%, so 22.3% precisely, Black, Indigenous, persons of color make up the population, and 77.7% are of white or European descent. And interestingly, too, both the US and Canada actually have more women than men, at 50.5% in the US and 50.4% in Canada. So that's an interesting little fact. Women make up the majority of the population. So we can discount that those two factors are in play, that publishers are making a reasoned decision based on their potential addressable market from an aggregate national perspective. That can't be the reason. And then, you drill in a little bit deeper and you realize that 82.66% of the US population lives in big cities. And, here's an example of one of the largest consumer hubs in the world. New York City has 57.27% BIPOC population and 42.73% white population. You look at Chicago and it's a 50-50 split. Similarly, you've got a very, very close, almost 50-50 split in Los Angeles. So big consumer hubs, large, population sizes. So we can discount that it's an urban consideration as well, because clearly that almost 50-50 split or more BIPOC individuals in these large consumer hubs cannot be the reason why artwork is skewing in this direction. So we can discount that. Then you look at Canada, and 81.2% of our population lives in big cities. And here's how our populations break down. It's a 50-50 split in Toronto, very, very similar to Chicago. We've got a 34.2% to 65.1% BIPOC versus white population in Montreal, large population there. And then we've got 67.3% BIPOC in the greater Vancouver population. So these are not the reasons. A population reason is not the reason that artwork on board games is skewing in this direction. So that can't be. So then we see the pivot. And this is a trope. This is a talking point that often is presented at this juncture, and this was certainly the case in this thread. Maybe board gaming doesn't appeal to non-white audiences or certain religions or sexes as much, said this commenter in response to my research. And some slightly less, more problematic and less polite. Some of us simply do not have this gene. This is an individual speaking to my research, indicating that, and these typos were left in, just wanted to, keep it completely in the integrity of that particular quote. The same, some people do not have any interest in gaming, so the statement that everybody likes or wants to game is false. So push back on the demography. So, okay, let's take that at its face value, and let's delve into that question. Do women, non-binary people, LGBTQ, and BIPOC individuals, do they like to game? So I did a late 2020 survey of 320 participants. There was a lot of interest in this, and I actually capped it at that level. I got participation and people asking if they could fill out the survey after I closed it, which was a bit heartbreaking, but I basically capped it at 320. What I found from that research, and I intentionally recruited for diversity, was 60.4% identified as women. That includes trans women in that total, as well as, you got the breakdown here, 25.3% identified as men, and that includes trans men in that total. 74.9%, so the vast majority were white, despite my recruiting very heavily for BIPOC. And this, again, was on various fora, including Twitter, Reddit, and Board Game Geek. And 20.4% identified as BIPOC, and 52.8% identified as LGBTQ plus, slightly more than half of the sample. And what's interesting about this sample is 70.7% game at least weekly, board game at least weekly. So very avid board gamers. And then, most of them, the majority of the sample, have been doing so for about more than 11 years. So, from a nerd cred check perspective, this diverse sample certainly would meet, the grilling of a gatekeeper in any kind of situation. They avidly board game, and they've been board gaming for a long, long time. And what this sample came back with is very strong agreement with the fact that board gaming has a problem with a lack of equitable racial representation in board game artwork at 84%, strongly agreeing or agreeing. And similarly, that they felt that board gaming has a problem with a lack of equitable gender representation in board game artwork at 83.6%. So overwhelmingly, they felt that there was a gap in the artwork of board games. So, really responding not to my numbers because they didn't see them, but their own perception of the board game industry. And even more chilling, and this is new to this presentation, 81.5% said they wished publishers would publish more games designed by women designers. And 81.7% agreed or strongly agreed that they wish publishers would publish more games designed by BIPOC designers. So that's a really big call to action. And then 82.8%, higher than that, wish publishers had more equitable gender representation in their board game artwork. And even higher than that, 84.9% agreed or strongly agreed that publishers should ensure that board game artwork has more equitable racial representation. So that's again a really big call to action. Still more concerning to me, from a publishing perspective, is that respondents agreed or strongly agreed that positive representation in games was linked to higher levels of enjoyment. And one of the things I think that might be at work, so we can basically discount these two population centers, the big cities, the big consumer hubs, certainly in North America, as a rationale for that dramatic skew. And we can also see from my numbers that, women, non-binary people, and BIPOC individuals game and game avidly from this diverse sample. So we have to ask ourselves, what's going on here? And one of the dynamics that I often see working with companies when I would help startups sort of plan their um, business strategy and their audience research is something called design empathy. And one of the examples of this is Dr. Rita Deverell, who's a Black journalist in Canada, talked a lot in a recent panel about the fact that she was constantly being admonished when she was working in various broadcast networks to create for, quote unquote, Susie in Saskatchewan. And the reason that she was admonished to do that, she's a Black journalist, is they were really sort of trying to play to the Midwest of Canada, a white, potentially rural or suburban white woman. That's who the audience was. And so that can change the way you work. And a rookie mistake in this sort of design empathy is that you imagine that your audience is exactly like you, thinks like you do, talks like you do, has the same experiences that you have had. And that often is very delimiting for company success. So then pivoting to the demography of game design, we can see from my findings that of the pool of the designers who created the top 400 Board Game Geek ranked games, 540 of them were white men. And this is just based on the listings. So white women were listed 16 times, BIPOC men 24 times, and white non-binary were listed 3 times. And that's a double count. So 11 white women, 1 white non-binary person, 540 white men, and 6 BIPOC men equaled the total number of that 400 Board Game Geek games. So very significant labor skew at 92.6% white men. So that's interesting. I'm often asked, how does this differ from the 2018 study? And I am sad to report that it doesn't differ much at all. It's 93.5% with a smaller pool of 200 games. So, first research question for the demography of design is it diverse? And it is not at all. And what is also, I think, very interesting, and certainly to publishers, anybody who creates games in the audience today, is I got a lot of comments that look a lot like this one. So remember, the vast majority of the people that I sampled were white, identified as white. And I got notes that sounded a lot like this one. I can't show you all of them because I got innumerable comments, but one of them was really illuminated all of the other comments, was, as a white person, I'm overjoyed when the entire cast of a game is BIPOC. So that's an interesting finding, because I find that often some of the discourses I see around game design is you don't want to alienate your audience. And if alienating your audience means including representation, you have to really sort of look in askance at that kind of approach. So my sample, majority white, overwhelming majority white, you can see that there's a real appetite for not seeing white people again and again and again on board game art. So, I think the last point I'm going to make, and I have other things to share, if there are questions later, I have so much data, is you're going to cause problems for your launch. And one analog we can see from the film industry is actually very illuminating. It's a very recent study done by Higginbotham, Phil Zeng, and Ulis in 2020 that looked at pre-pandemic box office and found that if you spend $159 million on your film, you're going to lose $32.2 million at your opening box office if you do not have authentically inclusive representation. And so, this should really be a warning signal to a lot of publishers of any kind of creative content that, you really need to do some modicum of audience research, looking at big consumer hubs, looking at the racial, gender composition of your audience, even at a basic level, to see where you're delimiting your growth by skewing in a particular racial or gender direction. And so we have to ask ourselves again, my theory is potentially design empathy. White designers may feel like, or white publishers, or a majority labor pool that is very skewed in a particular demographic direction may not be able to see or identify with a broader audience. But it's an imperative right now for publishers, people in this industry, to truly grow it to a level where it could be analogous with video games, where we can see that the average gamer, a digital gamer right now, is a woman. And that there is an incredible amount of diversity among the play audience in video gaming. So it's a real warning call, I think, the numbers I'm sharing with you today, for people who make and promote board games. So with that, I'm going to end on a couple of points that I thought were very encouraging. It is still difficult, as one commenter said in response to my survey, for women and people of color to get into the hobby, while some individuals still make it inhospitable for others. And, I can't go into this in a lot of detail because I'm running out of time, but 1 in 3 have experienced, for my survey, homophobic remarks. 1 in 3 experienced unwelcome sexual advances. 1 in 3 strongly agreed with the fact that when they engage with board game topics online, they've received online threats, insults, rude messages. And, one of the things that broke my heart in doing this survey is a lot of people said, yes, I can engage with board gaming, but I cannot be myself. And this one I can't stop thinking about, where it's an individual saying that I haven't engaged with the board game community outside of personal friends while they're transitioning. And that really broke my heart. And 1 in 3 of the respondents to my survey said they avoided public board game events before the pandemic for dynamics such as these. Not the only reason, but definitely one of the reasons. And a lot of feedback like this. I still love games. I still buy and play them, but I do so privately in small groups of friends I trust. And that is a delimiting dynamic. And so to sum things up, here's a comment from the thread I mentioned on Board Game Geek, that representation absolutely matters. And, it's a catalyst for change. And it might be more impactful for those with privilege to recognize and accept the unquestionable ability to accelerate or impede progress. And I really like that comment. And I just wanted to end on that. Thank you so much for your time and listening to me today. I really, really appreciate being here. And I will answer any questions you have in the question period.